How you doing, Gino? All right, good, good. Hey, good. Every time I come here, every time you two, don't you work?
Alright, today I'm going to be sharing with you the story of one of the most notorious mobsters that America has ever seen. But first, I'm going to talk to you about what it kind of means to be a gangster, like what this archetype entails. Now, throughout the history of America, we've had our fair share of gangsters, and you can see why looking back in retrospect. The glamour, the money, the women, the cars, the lifestyle associated with this career, I'll say, is very attractive to say the least. And we've seen many gangsters throughout the history of America. You know, Tommy gun wielding, funny speaking, lots of times depicted as Italian, but not to be racist. Gangsters. And you know, traditionally, like I said, gangsters are often depicted as Italian, but they're also depicted as ruthless. But but you wouldn't assume them to be, ruthless, like villainous murderers. You know, they tend to be well dressed, well groomed. Depicted in suits and fancy clothes, driving fancy cars, and taking out fancy women. The man I'm about to introduce to you is no different. He also lived a life of glitz and glamour, and indulged in all the things I had listed before, if not more, or most definitely more. This man was the embodiment of what it meant to be a gangster. This man, this monstrosity, is one of the members responsible for the most notorious and largest heist in United States history, this being the Lufthansa heist. This unbelievable mass of malice goes by the name Henry Hill. Now, in reality, Henry Hill wasn't actually this ruthless, like monstrous maniac that I kind of built him up to be, but he did do some bad things, or relatively bad things, compared to what you might consider normal. As I mentioned earlier, he was one of the people responsible for one of the most infamous heists in U.S. history, the Lufthansa heist, which him and the Lucchese crime family robbed an airport with 11 mobsters. Most of them were associates of the Lucchese crime family, but they stole about what was worth in that day $5.875 million, which, if you factor in inflation, today that would be worth more than $20 million. Think about that, getting $20 million in a day from a crime. It kind of puts it into perspective for me. But this heist that went down in infamy, it's not the only thing that Henry's famous for. Henry's story actually became popularized by a Martin Scorsese movie that you might know by the name of Goodfellas, which was actually based on a book by the name of Wise Guy, which was written by Nicholas Peggy. But yeah, it was adapted to film by Martin Scorsese, and this really popularized the story of Henry Hill as this, this New York street kid. He's part Irish. He grows up on the streets of New York. He's basically surrounded by mobsters, running rampant throughout New York during this time. There's lots of crime families, lots of crews to get involved in, and eventually he does. Henry feels that school's not really the thing for him, and he starts making connections.
My father was always pissed off. He was pissed that he made such lousy money. He was pissed that my kid brother Michael was in a wheelchair. He was pissed that there were 7 of us living in such a tiny house.
Why don't you tell me about this? It's a letter from school. It says you haven't been there in months. In months! You think you're so smart? You're nothing but bum! You want to grow up to be a bum?
But after a while, he was mostly pissed because I hung around the cab stand. He knew what went on at that cab stand, and every once in a while I'd have to take a beating. But by then I didn't care. The way I saw it, everybody takes a beating sometime.
Henry gets involved with Paul Vario, which was a capo for the Lucchese crime family. And he dropped out of school at just age 14 to start working for Paul. He starts off doing, like minor things like deliveries and picking up money from local rackets, bringing him to the boss. But very quickly, his involvement with the crew grew exponentially. And he very soon became involved in things like arson and assault and even credit card fraud. And through his connections with the Paul Vario's crew and the Lucchese crime family, he very soon met his longtime friend, or soon-to-be longtime friend, James Burke, or AKA Jimmy the Jet. And ultimately, Jimmy Burke would also be one of the primary orchestrators of the Lufthansa heist later in Henry's life. Henry Hill's ultimate downfall came not from the Lufthansa heist, but from his dabbling in narcotics. He ran a major drug operation which sold, a variety of things like obviously weed, cocaine, heroin, your big things. Cocaine was a huge one, especially in that time period. And it was the drugs that ultimately doomed Henry Hill, at least in terms of his life of crime. He was eventually arrested on charges of drug trafficking in April of 1980. And this is where Henry kind of betrayed his entire upbringing in a way, because a lot of his upbringing was just heavy mob involvement. And they were his family. He grew up with these people, he always worked for these people, and he kind of swore by this lifestyle, and he betrayed all that when he became a snitch. He became an informant for the FBI in order to, make things easier on himself after he was arrested for said drug trafficking. Henry Hill's testimony, in which he spoke about the Lufthansa heist, led to the conviction of a lot of the people involved. This got Henry placed in witness protection, but Henry kept kind of screwing himself and revealing who he really was, just telling everyone, hey, I'm this mobster, this infamous mobster from New York that pulled off one of the biggest and most greatest heists in the history of the United States. Henry Hill later died in June 12th of 2012 to congestive heart failure in Los Angeles, California. Henry's story actually inspired, the book Wise Guy by Nicholas Pileggi, which was later adapted to a film by Martin Scorsese, which grew to be one of the most beloved films of the time, and I'd say of all time. It really is highly regarded. It's said to be a great film, which I agree with. Goodfellas. This is kind of what popularized, in my opinion, Henry's story, and what brought it to most people's attention.
As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster.
I know I'd go from rags to riches if you would only say you care.
And Goodfellas is the movie that kind of brought Henry's story to the big screen. It really shined a light on his story, and it shined a light onto that lifestyle, which seemed attractive to so many people because of this movie. And Martin Scorsese does a great job with it. If we're all being honest, it's a pretty good movie. Although it's not completely accurate to what really happened. For instance, some things are greatly dramatized, but it's still, portions of it are faithful to Henry's life, which you can see in some of the interviews he did regarding the film, or the book Wise Guy, which the movie is an adaptation of. Both are based on his real life events, and both do a good job of bringing attention to them. Besides some moderate to even extreme exaggerations in the film, and some, like minor things like name changes for Thomas DeSimone and other various characters in Henry's life, it is a faithful adaptation. One thing the movie doesn't really do, though, is go into much detail about the Lufthansa heist, which is one of the things that Henry's most famous for, along with his Lucchese family associates and Jimmy Burke and Thomas DeSimone and all else who were involved. But this heist was, as I said earlier in the podcast, they stole $5 million worth of cash from the airport and another almost $1 million worth of jewelry. And today, as I said earlier in the podcast as well, that would be worth over $20 million, making this one of the largest heists ever pulled, not only in the U.S., but just in general. This is a heist of massive proportions. So, despite, dramatizations of the film or even of the book, Wise Guys, Henry Hill will go down in history as one of the most notorious mobsters of the United States. Maybe not at the level of, say, someone like Lucky Luciano or John Gotti or Al Capone, but Henry Hill definitely does have that cult factor of, having a movie about him, and a good movie at that, unlike John Gotti, which had John Travolta in it. That poor pile of waste, that pile of filth is hot garbage. Goodfellas is really good, and that's why Henry Hill is one of the favorite, he's a favorite of mine, both as a fictitious character in the film and the real life story that it's based upon. I find Henry Hill very cool.